Now we are going to study the nerve supply of the parotid gland. The nerve supply of the parotid gland is sensory and it is also secretomotor. The sensory nerve supply to the parotid gland is coming from two nerves. One nerve supplies the fascia which covers the parotid gland, that is the capsule of the parotid gland, which was formed by the investing layer of deep cervical fascia. And this nerve is the anterior division of the great auricular nerve. So, the great auricular nerve, which is itself a branch of the cervical plexus, it gives the sensory nerve supply to the capsule of the parotid gland. Then, the sensory nerve supply to the substance of the parotid gland is supplied by the mandibular nerve. The main important thing is the secretomotor nerve supply, or the nerve supply which produces secretions from the gland, and it is the secretions of the parotid gland are not in your control. You cannot control the secretions of your gland, so that means it is working automatically, so it must have an automatic or an autonomic nerve supply. So the before studying the autonomic nerve supply of the parotid gland, we first need to know the basic plan how the autonomic nervous system works. I will give a detailed video about the autonomic nervous system later, but I'm just giving you an overview of how the autonomic nervous system works. Autonomic nervous system may be the sympathetic or the parasympathetic system. It has a one basic plan. It has an origin. Then comes the ganglion. Then comes the effector organ, which in our case is the parotid gland. The origin of the autonomic nervous system is a nucleus. Now, what is a nucleus? Nucleus is a collection of cell bodies of neurons within the central nervous system. Now, when I say central nervous system, I mean the spinal cord and the brain. So, we will have a nucleus, which is the origin of the autonomic nervous system. It is a collection of cell bodies within the central nervous system, that is the spinal cord or the brain. Then comes the ganglion. A ganglion is similar to the nucleus, but it is lying outside the central nervous system. So it is a collection of cell bodies of neurons outside the central nervous system. Then comes the effector organ, which in our case is the parotid gland. The axons from the cell bodies of the nucleus, that is the origin of the nervous system or autonomic nervous system, they move towards the ganglion and synapse there. As these fibers, the axons, are lying, they come before the ganglion, so they are called the preganglionic fibers. When they synapse on the ganglion, the information is carried from this cell body in the axons of this cell body, and they move towards the effector organs. Now, the axons which are coming from the cell bodies of ganglion, as they are coming after the ganglion, they are called the postganglionic fibers. The postganglionic fibers will innervate the organ, the effector organ, and the activity will start, which in the case of parotid gland are the salivary secretions. Now, for the parotid gland, we will try to find the origin, then we will find the ganglion, also its location. Then, effect, you already know the effector organ, that is the parotid gland. Then we will find the fibers, the preganglionic fibers, from where they start and which course they take to reach the ganglion. And we will also see the postganglionic fibers, the course which they take to reach the parotid gland. Now, to understand all this, first you will have to see this cranial cavity. This is the lateral aspect of skull, and if I move it like this, you can see the cranial cavity. You can see that it is in three steps. The anterior part is higher, and this is called the anterior cranial fossa. The middle part is lower than the anterior part, this is called the middle cranial fossa, and the posterior part is the lowest, and this is called the posterior cranial fossa, and it has a big foramen in it, which is called the foramen magnum, through which the brainstem goes out and forms the spinal cord. I am going to make a simple diagram to show you these cranial fossa. So I am going to split the skull in a sagittal section from here, and you will see the lateral aspect of the sagittal section of skull in the diagram. Now here I have drawn a diagram and I'll show this diagram and compare it with the original skull. This portion is the anterior cranial fossa. So in the sagittal section you will see this is the anterior cranial fossa. This is the forehead, the nose, the mouth. This is the anterior cranial fossa. Then comes the middle cranial fossa, which is this portion. And in this middle cranial fossa, I have shown a foramen, an opening, which is called the foramen ovale. And in the original skull, it is lying over here at the tip of my pen. This is the foramen ovale of the right side, and this is the foramen ovale of the left side. If we go behind the lower part, this is called the posterior cranial fossa, and this is the foramen magnum. So this is the posterior cranial fossa, and this is the foramen magnum, and this is the place where the brain stem, that is the midbrain, pons, and medulla are located. So this is the brain stem, the midbrain is the upper part, the pons, and this is the medulla, and this is the cerebellum, and it continues down through the foramen magnum as the spinal cord. This opening here is the jugular foramen. The jugular foramen in the original skull is seen somewhere over here. This is the jugular foramen of the right side, and this is the jugular foramen of the left side. The bone between the jugular foramen and this foramen ovale, this is called the petrous part of the temporal bone. That means this area is the petrous part of temporal bone. Now I am going to the inferior aspect of the skull to show you the jugular foramen and foramen ovale and the petrous temporal bone from the inferior aspect. Now this is the inferior aspect of the skull. This structure here is the jugular foramen. This is the foramen ovale, and this is the petrous part of the temporal bone. This is the external acoustic meatus. That means the sound waves enter here. So the middle ear must be somewhere over here between these two foramina. So the structures which come out of the jugular foramen, they will pass beneath the floor of the middle ear. Again I'll show you from the inside, then from the outside. This is the jugular foramen from the inside. This is the foramen ovale inside, and this is the petrous temporal bone. That means the middle ear is somewhere inside this bone. So anything which passes through the jugular foramen, they will pass through the floor, beneath the floor of the middle ear cavity. So in this diagram, this box-like structure is the middle ear cavity, and this bone is the petrous temporal bone within which this box or the middle ear cavity, which is also called the tympanic cavity, is located. This is the jugular foramen below the middle ear cavity. So anything which passes through the jugular foramen will pass beneath this middle ear, and this is the foramen ovale. Now I have added a few more things in the diagram. I'll show you what these are. Now from the brainstem, from the anterior aspect of the pons is a nerve which is emerging, which is called the fifth nerve or the trigeminal nerve. This trigeminal nerve leads to a ganglion which is called the semilunar ganglion because it is half moon shaped. From the trigeminal ganglion arises the three branches of the trigeminal nerve, which are the ophthalmic, the maxillary, and the mandibular nerves. We are concerned with the mandibular nerve at this time, so we'll stick to that. The mandibular nerve passes through the foramen ovale and goes out of the base of the skull. So this is the foramen ovale which I showed you in the original skull over here. So the mandibular nerve passes from here and it goes down to the base of the skull. As it goes down, it has a ganglion hanging from it. This is called the otic ganglion. This is the otic ganglion, and after that the mandibular nerve splits into two branches, an anterior branch and a posterior branch. So this is the anterior division of the mandibular nerve, and this is the posterior division of mandibular nerve. From the anterior division of mandibular nerve, a branch emerges which is called the auriculotemporal nerve, which basically supplies the auricle, the pinna of the ear, and the temporal region, and it also gives a branch to the parotid gland. So we will stick to this branch which is supplying the parotid gland. Now I have added another structure in my diagram. This is another nerve which is emerging from the medulla oblongata, and this is called the ninth cranial nerve or the glossopharyngeal nerve. The glossopharyngeal nerve passes through the jugular foramen. And as I also already mentioned that the structures which are passing through the jugular foramen will pass beneath the floor of the middle ear cavity. So the ninth nerve passes beneath the floor of the middle ear cavity. While passing beneath the floor of the middle ear cavity, it gives off a branch which enters the middle ear cavity. As the middle ear cavity is also called the tympanic cavity, so this branch is called the tympanic branch. Now we will trace the fibers and we will find the nucleus, the origin of the autonomic nervous system. Then we will trace the preganglionic fibers, make them reach the ganglion, and from there we will find the postganglionic fibers and they will reach the parotid gland. So this red nucleus, this is a red colored, this is not a red nucleus, this is a red colored nucleus which lies in the lower part of pons, and this is called the inferior salivatory nucleus or salivatory nucleus, whatever you want to call it. This is a nucleus which I already told you that the origin of the autonomic nervous system must be a nucleus within the CNS, central nervous system. So in the case of the autonomic nerve supply or the parasympathetic nerve supply to the parotid gland, we should have a nucleus within the CNS. So as this is the part of CNS and we have a nucleus within it, this is called the inferior salivatory nucleus. So this is the parasympathetic nucleus which is going to supply the secretomotor fibers to the parotid gland. As it is a nucleus, it must have a lot of cell bodies. The axons of these cell bodies form the preganglionic fibers. So the preganglionic fibers leave the nucleus and they enter the glossopharyngeal nerve or the ninth nerve. While passing through the ninth nerve, as they reach the tympanic branch, they will enter the tympanic branch. And when they reach the middle ear cavity, they form a plexus within the middle ear cavity, which is called the tympanic plexus. From the tympanic plexus arises a branch which is called a lesser petrosal nerve, which reaches the middle cranial fossa. This is the middle cranial fossa. The lesser petrosal nerve emerges from here and it will move forward towards the foramen ovale. So the lesser petrosal nerve moves forward, reaches the foramen ovale, and exits the skull. It then enters the otic ganglion and it synapses with the cell bodies which are lying within the otic ganglion. So this is the parasympathetic ganglion which I already mentioned that the autonomic nervous system must have a ganglion. So in case of the nerve supply to the parotid gland, the ganglion here is the otic ganglion. Now the cells of the otic ganglion, the neuronal cell bodies within the otic ganglion, they give off the postganglionic fibers which start from the otic ganglion. They enter the mandibular nerve. From the mandibular nerve, they will pass through its anterior division. From the anterior division, they will enter the auriculotemporal nerve, and through the auriculotemporal nerve, they will reach the parotid gland. And when this loop starts firing, the parotid gland starts its secretion. I'm just going to repeat quickly the uh, autonomic nerve supply or the parasympathetic nerve supply to the parotid gland. It starts from the inferior salivatory nucleus. The preganglion, the nucleus, this is the origin of the parasympathetic supply to the parotid gland. From here, the preganglionic fibers start. They enter the ninth nerve or the glossopharyngeal nerve. From the glossopharyngeal nerve, they enter the tympanic branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve. Through the tympanic branch, they reach the tympanic cavity, and there they form a plexus of nerves by joining two other nerves, which is called the tympanic plexus. From the tympanic plexus, the fibers emerge through the roof of the middle ear cavity and they reach the middle cranial fossa. From the middle cranial fossa, these fibers move forward as the lesser petrosal nerve and they dip down through the foramen ovale and reach the base of skull where already the otic ganglion is located. They will enter the otic ganglion and synapse with the cell bodies which are located within the otic ganglion. Then the axon, these are the preganglionic fibers, the ones made in red. Then the ganglion, the nucleus in the cell bodies in the ganglion give off axons which act as the postganglionic fibers because they are starting from the latter part of the ganglion. They start from the ganglion, they enter the mandibular nerve, reach its anterior division. From the anterior division, they enter the auriculotemporal nerve, which is the branch of the anterior division, and through the auriculotemporal nerve, they reach the parotid gland and they start secretion.